Welcome back to the deep dive. AI is rapidly transforming almost everything around us, from how we get around to how government services operate. And while the potential benefits are enormous, we've all seen and discussed the serious questions it raises about fairness, privacy, and unintended consequences. Using AI responsibly isn't just a nice to have anymore. It's becoming, well, an absolute necessity.
Absolutely. And that focus on responsibility needs to be baked into the entire process, right?
Right.
Right from the initial idea through development and into day-to-day use.
Yeah,
It requires a deliberate, structured approach, not just, hoping for the best.
exactly. Today, we're going to do something a little different. We're taking you inside a specific, real-world document developed by the Dutch government specifically, collaborators within their Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management, working with teams like ILTID Lab and RWS Data Lab. Our source is the AI Auditor AI Impact Assessment.pdf, version 2.0 from December 2024. This isn't some theoretical paper. It's a practical tool designed to guide organizations through that crucial thought process of responsible AI deployment.
It's a fascinating window, actually, into how a government body grappling with really concrete issues, roads, water, transport, is trying to ensure its use of AI is sound, accountable, and aligns with public values and legal requirements.
So our mission for this deep dive is basically to be your instructors, guiding you step by step through this AI Impact Assessment framework, the AIA as they call it, just as laid out in the document. We'll break down its structure, explain its purpose, and walk through the key considerations it forces users to confront, all aimed at achieving what they call responsible AI by design.
Yeah, and the document itself states its core purpose is to support the thought process around AI. It aims to increase accountability, improve the quality of AI systems, make their deployment reproducible, and, critically, help prevent those unintended negative consequences we all worry about.
Right.
But at the same time, it wants to ensure organizations are positioned to fully exploit the opportunities AI offers, but, in a controlled, responsible way.
And it's designed to be pretty comprehensive. It makes you think about every stage. The
Mm.
potential obstacles in data collection, the specific choices made about the AI system itself and its algorithms, and how it interacts with relevant legislation like the European Union's AI Act, which is a huge piece of the puzzle right now.
Definitely. The structure of the document reflects that. It's divided into two main parts. Part A, which is the core assessment, essentially asking, should we even do this?
Yeah.
And Part B, which is about implementation and use, kind of like, okay, how do we do this right? Plus, it includes vital appendices and a glossary to clarify terms. We'll follow this flow precisely.
All right, let's jump in then. The document starts by emphasizing that the AII is a tool, not the ultimate goal itself. The goal is responsible AI. The assessment is just the means to get there. It's specifically built for AI systems, defined here as machine-based systems with a learning component.
Right. But they also make a practical note. Even for simpler algorithms, those without a learning component that just follow a fixed set of rules, you can still use this framework.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it might not be mandatory in those cases, but the questions it raises are still really valuable for thinking through impact and implementation, even for less complex automation.
Got it. A really critical concept they introduce early on is that the assessment is tied to a specific context and purpose.
Yes, this is key.
So if you have an AI system, say one trained to recognize ships for monitoring waterways, and you decide you want to use it for a different purpose, maybe recognizing other types of vehicles, or for a completely different task like predicting maintenance needs, you need to do a new AIIA.
Exactly. The original assessment is basically invalid because the context and purpose have changed. That changes the potential risks and impacts.
That's a really important point about the dynamic nature of AI deployment. It's not a one-time check.
No, absolutely not. And right alongside that, they immediately connect the AIIA to the AI Act. They state you must always apply its risk levels: unacceptable, high, and minimal risk.
Okay.
And the required measures, the things you have to do, are directly linked to that risk categorization. They point you to Appendix 1 for the specifics on that.
So if you start with maybe a low-risk application, but something about its use evolves or expands, pushing it into the high-risk category under the AI Act.
Then this document explicitly states that stricter requirements kick in.
Right.
It's designed to evolve with the system's potential impact.
That makes sense.
And this directly leads to another foundational requirement they highlight: the need for a multidisciplinary team to complete the AIA.
Yeah. Not just one person.
No way. You simply cannot have just one person or even one type of expert fill this out. You need technical people like data scientists and AI engineers, definitely legal experts to navigate regulations, domain experts who understand the specific area where the AI is being applied, process owners.
So a whole mix.
A whole mix. Different sections of the document require input from different specialists. They even provide a handy table suggesting, who should tackle which parts.
That makes complete sense.
Yeah.
AI impacts so many different areas that you need those diverse perspectives at the table to even identify all the potential issues.
Precisely. Now, about the flow between Part A and Part B. Although they are distinct sections, the document stresses that they are deeply interconnected. They often influence each other.
How so?
Well, Part A, the assessment part, helps you decide whether to use the system by looking at purpose, solution, and effects. But sometimes evaluating the feasibility or impact in Part A requires looking ahead to technical details covered in Part B.
Oh, okay. Like what?
For example, the choice of algorithm, which is discussed in Part B, can significantly impact its energy consumption, which is an assessment point back in Part A under sustainability.
So you might dip into Part B topics while you're still in the assessment phase of Part A.
Yes. And maybe more importantly, decisions or realities you encounter during implementation, that's Part B, can actually invalidate or change assumptions you made during the initial assessment in Part A.
Right.
So if you assume to say certain data quality in Part A, but during Part B you find the available data just doesn't meet that standard, you might need to revisit and potentially revise your decision back in Part A.
It's definitely an iterative process then.
Exactly. It's not linear.
That highlights that this isn't just paperwork. It's meant to be a living guide throughout the project. And the document clarifies when to use it. It can be used in every phase, development, procurement, and they strongly recommend using it from the very start.
Yeah, bake in responsibility from day one.
But, and this is a hard requirement, the AIIA must be completed when the system goes into production.
Right, even pilots.
Even if it's just a small pilot project, you need to have gone through this assessment before it's actively used in an operational environment. They even show its intended use across different phases, like quick scan, project plan, during development, and in production.
It's a life cycle tool, really.
It is. And they give practical tips on how to use the document itself. Some questions are marked blue. Those are mandatory and must be answered. Others are green, additional or relevant questions that you should answer if they apply to your specific project.
And all those bold terms you see throughout the document, they're defined in the glossary at the back. That's super helpful for ensuring everyone is on the same page with terminology, especially with that multidisciplinary team.
Yeah, good point.
And they mention a fill-in template is available to make the process more structured. They also explicitly state that a simple yes or no just won't cut it. You need to provide detailed reasoning and documentation for your answers.
You need to show your work, basically.
Exactly. Show your thinking. And one final kind of sobering note they include up front is a cautionary reminder. Just completing the AIIA framework doesn't magically guarantee your AI system is perfectly safe, secure, or compliant.
Right. It's not a silver bullet.
Yeah, no. Government audit bodies, like the Central Government Audit Service or the Netherlands Court of Audit, might still come in and check the system. And while the AIIA covers many things, for high-risk systems under the AI Act, completing Appendix 1 is specifically mandatory for compliance with those legal obligations.
Okay, that sets the stage nicely. Let's unpack Part A assessment. This is where the fundamental question is posed. Is the impact of applying this AI system proportionate to the intended objectives?
Yeah, this is the foundational decision point. Part A forces you to step back and look at the big picture, the purpose, the proposed solution, all the potential effects to decide if using AI is even the right path in the first place.
And it's grounded in those principles of proportionality and subsidiarity.
Exactly. Is the impact a reasonable price to pay for the goal? And critically, are there less radical, less impactful ways to achieve the same result?
And they note that if this assessment gets tricky, maybe there's a clear conflict of interest or you identify a potential breach of fundamental rights, the document suggests using specific tools designed for structured ethical discussions.
Things like the IBDS data dialogue or moral consultations. It acknowledges that this isn't always straightforward and sometimes requires dedicated ethical deliberation.
It's about providing tools to facilitate those necessary, sometimes difficult conversations around ethical and societal impact.
Precisely.
So Section 1 of Part A is all about the system, purpose, and necessity. This is the why.
Right. And the document is very clear here. The application of AI is not an aim in itself. The goal isn't to use AI. The goal is to solve a specific problem or improve a process within the organization.
Okay.
This section is where you articulate exactly what that problem is and define the AI system's role in addressing it.
Question 1.1.1 asks for that clear purpose and intended result defining the problem, where and when it occurs, who it affects, target groups, the domain it's in, the process it fits into. It's about getting laser focused on the actual goal.
Then comes question 1.1.2, which is that critical link to the AI Act we mentioned. Which risk level does your system fall into? Unacceptable, high, or minimal?
Ah, yes, the risk levels.
And they even recommend consulting Appendix 1 right away, even at this early stage, to get clarity on your legal obligations before proceeding much further.
And the framework has a hard stop here if the risk is unacceptable, doesn't it?
Absolutely. If your AI system falls into the unacceptable risk category as defined by the AI Act, the document instructs you to stop. Full stop. It's not permitted, and you don't proceed with the rest of the assessment for deployment.
But if it's high risk, what then?
If it's high risk, you do continue with the main AIIA, but you must also complete Appendix 1, which lists all those additional legal obligations under the AI Act. For minimal or low-risk systems, the standard AIIA is sufficient.
Okay. And question 1.1.3 is practical. Where exactly in the organization or which specific processes will this system be used? This anchors the assessment in the operational reality.
Right. Then moving on to section 1.2, intended solution. Now that you know why you're considering AI, this section asks how you plan to solve that problem with it.
Question 1.2.1 asks for a brief technical description. What kind of AI system is it? What technology does it use? What data is involved? What type of algorithm? The basic.
But then 1.2.2 pushes for justification. Why did you choose this specific form of AI? Why a generative AI or a decision tree or a neural network as opposed to other technical approaches? You need to provide a solid rationale.
Which leads directly to 1.2.3. What alternatives did you consider? Did you look at a non-AI solution, maybe a simpler AI approach, or a different algorithm type altogether?
Yeah, this is where you demonstrate you've truly considered subsidiarity, that you picked the most appropriate, least impactful solution necessary to meet the goal, not just the newest or flashiest one.
Considering and documenting these alternatives is crucial for justifying the use of AI in the first place, especially in a public sector context.
Absolutely.
Section 1.3 is about the role within the organization. This is defining who is responsible and who does what, getting that clear.
Ownership is non-negotiable here. Just like any critical IT system, an AI system needs clear ownership, a commissioning client, a project leader, and someone with ultimate responsibility within the organization. This section ensures that's all sorted out.
Question 1.3.1 asks for the task division during the setup phase. Who's the developer, internal and external, the commissioning client, project leader, IT management, and who holds that ultimate responsibility? And if external parties are involved, what are the contractual agreements defining roles and responsibilities? They helpfully point to the glossary for clear definitions of these roles, too.
Then 1.3.2 broadens the view to the people involved beyond just the core team. Who are the actual users, the employees working with the system day to day?
Okay.
Who are the end users, citizens, or others directly impacted by the system's output? And who are any other parties involved, like maybe civil society groups or other government bodies?
So distinguishing those different groups is important.
Very important, because their needs and how you interact with them will differ significantly. And questions 1.3.3 and 1.3.4 emphasize consultation. Which stakeholders and groups were consulted during the project? How is their feedback collected, especially from diverse backgrounds or groups that might be disproportionately affected?
And crucially, how is that feedback actually followed up on? It's not just ticking a box saying you consulted.
Right. Did you actually use the feedback?
Exactly. This really underscores the value the framework places on early and broad engagement to anticipate potential issues and ensure the system serves the public responsibly.
Section 1.4 moves to maintenance and administration. This might seem like standard IT ops, but the document frames it specifically for AI, right?
It does. AI systems aren't set it and forget it. They need ongoing maintenance, monitoring, updates. The document notes that even for a pilot or a proof of concept, you should think early on about how it would transition to a production environment.
That makes sense. Foresight prevents headaches later.
Definitely. You don't want to discover later that your chosen AI technology can't be properly managed within the organization's standard IT infrastructure, for example. So, question 1.4.1 asks about task division for administration and maintenance, again covering both internal teams and external contracts.
And a particularly relevant question for a government body using AI is 1.4.2. How will new or updated laws and regulations be taken into account during the entire lifespan of the AI system?
Oof, yeah. The legal landscape for AI is evolving so rapidly, that's a huge compliance challenge.
It really is. Then 1.4.3 asks if the necessary management expertise for the system has been documented. Do you have the people with the right skills in place or a plan to get them?
Okay.
And 1.4.4 asks how changes in the system's context, like the operating environment or the characteristics of the data it receives, will be considered and managed over its lifetime. AI systems don't operate in a vacuum.
Okay, that covers the purpose and necessity part of the assessment quite thoroughly. Section 2 delves into the actual impact.
Right. This is where you systematically identify the potential effects, both positive and negative, across key areas: fundamental rights, sustainability, and broader societal prosperity. It's designed to guide you through these impacts in a structured sequence.
And this section ties directly into something called the IAMA, the Fundamental Rights and Algorithm Impact Assessment.
Yes, exactly. The AIA is designed to build upon and enhance the IMA, and in many cases, fulfilling this section of the AIIA can cover much of the required IMA assessment. This connection really highlights how central the impact on fundamental rights is to this entire framework.
So Section 2.1 focuses specifically on fundamental rights.
Protecting the fundamental rights of everyone involved, citizens, employees, other parties, is presented as paramount. The document explicitly references the Dutch Constitution and the European Convention on Human Rights. They suggest consulting the IAMA Appendix on Fundamental Rights Clusters as a helpful resource here.
And they introduce a scale for potential breaches, minor, medium, or severe, is that right?
Sure. Correct. They state that any potential medium or severe breach of a fundamental right requires extra careful consideration and specific documented measures to mitigate it. While Part B covers measures for specific rights like data protection, this section prompts you to think broadly about all fundamental rights that could potentially be impacted by your specific AI application.
So 2.1.1 asks directly about the potential impact on citizens' fundamental rights. Pretty straightforward.
Then 2.1.2 is critical for government systems. What is the underlying legal basis for using this AI system and for any decisions made based on its output? Government action requires a legal foundation. You can't just deploy AI without one.
Right, and 2.1.3 asks about applicable constitutional provisions.
And 2.1.4 takes it a crucial step further. Which of those constitutional provisions might potentially be breached if the AI system is improperly designed or implemented? This requires serious foresight and, frankly, legal expertise.
Identifying potential constitutional breaches sounds like a major red flag in this assessment.
It absolutely is.
Okay, Section 2.2 covers sustainability. Thinking about the ecological footprint of the AI system.
Yeah. AI, particularly training and running these huge models, can consume significant amounts of energy, water, raw materials. This section asks you to consider that environmental impact throughout the system's lifecycle development, installation, use.
Question 2.2.1 asks about that environmental impact and, crucially, how it will be measured.
Right. And they acknowledge this can be difficult to quantify right now, partly due to a lack of transparency from some tech providers about their energy consumption. So for now, it's often more about considering sustainable options where possible.
Like what?
Well, they offer practical tips. Simpler models generally use less energy than large, complex ones. Text processing is usually less demanding than image processing, things like that.
But AI can also help with sustainability goals too, can't it?
Exactly. The document highlights that. So 2.2.2 asks what measures have been taken to minimize negative environmental impact, and it suggests you can weigh the environmental cost of running the AI against any environmental gains achieved because you are using the AI.
Like optimizing traffic flow to reduce emissions.
Precisely that kind of thing, balancing the costs and benefits.
Section 2.3 is for other effects. It sounds like a catch-all.
Kind of. It's where you capture impacts not neatly fitting into fundamental rights or sustainability. This section is flexible, designed to capture project-specific effects, and it can draw from potential issues you anticipate based on the implementation details covered later in Part B.
What kind of things might go here?
They provide a list of potential areas to consider. Public values, like trustworthiness or transparency, referencing a toolbox from the Ministry of Interior and Kingdom Relations. How it aligns with the organization's mission, like INW's goal for a better Netherlands. Short versus long-term effects, impacts on individuals, the organization, or society as a whole.
And importantly, both positive opportunities and negative risks.
Yes. It's not just problem finding, it's also about identifying how the AI contributes positively. Question 2.3.1 asks specifically how the system supports or contributes to the organization's mission.
Okay.
And 2.3.2 is the broader question. Are there any other relevant effects, positive or negative risks, effects specific to certain groups, impacts at different levels, or effects on broad prosperity that you need to consider for this specific AI system? It's really a call for comprehensive thinking beyond the predefined categories.
That brings us to section 3, assessing whether or not to use the AI system. This feels like the culmination of Part A's assessment process.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
This is the moment of truth. Based on everything you've documented in sections 1 and 2, the purpose, alternatives considered, all the potential impacts, positive and negative, across fundamental rights, sustainability, other areas, do you proceed?
So you revisit those core principles of proportionality and subsidiarity again.
Exactly. Is the anticipated impact truly proportionate to the goals you hope to achieve? Have you genuinely explored and ruled out less impactful alternatives? The document emphasizes the need for clear, defensible reasoning here. You need to explicitly consider whether using the system would unfairly disadvantage any specific groups.
And they are quite blunt about stopping if needed.
They are. They state clearly there are scenarios where the identified impact is simply too significant to proceed. If the assessment reveals a likely fundamental rights breach, or if the system is legally prohibited, identified back in section 1.1.2 as unacceptable risk, you stop. The impact is deemed too great.
Question 3.2 asks if, assuming you decide to move forward, there are additional measures you need to take, maybe within existing operational processes, not just in the tech itself.
Yes, exactly. Measures needed to ensure responsible use, even if the core AI system gets the green light. So Part A provides that structured process for making the fundamental go-no-go decision, weighing necessity and alternatives against a really comprehensive assessment of potential impacts across various critical domains.
All right, that gives us a complete picture of the assessment phase. Now let's shift gears to Part B, implementation and use of AI system. If Part A is the should we, Part B is definitely the how do we build and operate it responsibly.
Exactly right. Part B is where the technical expertise really comes to the forefront. You'll need your data scientists, engineers, IT specialists heavily involved here. It dives into the specifics of designing, building, and using the system in a way that aligns with the responsible AI principles discussed back in Part A.
Section 4 of Part B is technical robustness. This is about ensuring the system functions reliably and performs as expected under various conditions.
And the very first topic within technical robustness, Section 4.1, is dedicated to bias.
Bias. Such a critical and honestly complex issue in AI. How does the document frame it?
They define bias simply as making assumptions about things, people, or groups. But they immediately clarify that bias has two sides. One side is actually necessary for AI to function. Generalizing from data involves making assumptions to predict or classify new situations. But the problematic side, the one we worry about, is when this leads to unjustified distortion, unfairness, discrimination, or outcomes that conflict with human rights or regulations.
And where does bias typically enter an AI system?
They list the main culprits. Bias in the input, meaning the data itself is skewed or unrepresentative. Bias in the model, where the algorithm learns and potentially amplifies existing biases in the data.
Right.
And bias in the output, where the results produced by the system lead to unfair consequences for certain groups. They also mention design bias, which can stem from technical choices or assumptions made by the people who built the system.
So the document isn't saying you can achieve bias-free AI. That seems impossible.
No, it explicitly states that working completely without bias can be impossible. Bias is often deeply embedded in the data we collect and the societal assumptions it reflects. They use the powerful example of large language models trained on vast amounts of internet data.
Which is full of bias.
Exactly. It naturally contains all the biases and prejudices accumulated online over years. So the goal isn't zero bias, but rather a high level of awareness of potential discrimination and taking concrete steps to prevent unfair outcomes. It's about integrity and mitigation.
They also connect bias to human diversity and fairness, but note it can apply to non-human aspects too, like environmental data. And they suggest thinking about whether the bias causes a negative impact, no impact, or even potentially a positive impact.
Yes, it's nuanced. Question 4.1.1 is the broad starting point. How will potentially undesirable bias in input, model, and output be taken into account throughout the system's life? It's an ongoing thing.
Then they get more specific. For bias in the input data, they ask things like, is the data relevant and representative? 4.1.2. If you use random sampling, did you protect subpopulations from being excluded? 4.1.3. And was the choice of which variables to use justified? 4.1.4.
Hmm. Then for bias in the model, they ask about measures taken during development to prevent the algorithm from creating or exacerbating unfair bias. 4.1.5. And crucially, is the system designed to be usable by all intended end users, regardless of their personal characteristics like age, gender, disability, etc.? 4.1.6.
That's important for accessibility.
Very. And for bias in the output data, 4.1.7 asks about specific mechanisms like stop mechanisms, extra supervision, or monitoring to prevent certain groups from being disproportionately impacted by negative outcomes. They even reference the ILT, Human Environment and Transport Inspectorate, needing to differentiate impacts on regulated parties versus the general public, which is an interesting specific example.
So this section demands a proactive and ongoing effort to identify and mitigate bias throughout the system's development and deployment. It's not a one-off check.
Definitely not.
Okay, section 4.2 is accuracy.
Accuracy here means two things: performing effectively from a technical standpoint, getting the right answers, but also being effective in achieving the intended outcome in assessments. Is it actually useful?
Right. And they stress that accuracy isn't just a development metric. It needs to be measured continuously once the system is in production. The classic phrase garbage in and quality out is very relevant here. The quality of your training data directly impacts accuracy.
So AI systems aren't a static product. They need constant evaluation and potentially retraining.
Exactly. They describe AI systems as a work in progress that needs regular testing and potential retraining as conditions change, as data drifts. It's also desirable, they say, to be able to quantify how likely an incorrect assessment is.
How does the document suggest ensuring accuracy?
It requires setting clear acceptance criteria upfront for both the training data and the system's performance. These could be minimum data requirements or threshold values for certain metrics.
What kind of metrics?
Well, for measuring performance, they list standard data science metrics like accuracy score, precision, recall, F1 score, usual suspects.
And they caution that just looking at one metric like overall accuracy can be really misleading, right? Absolutely. They use an excellent example. Imagine a system trying to identify specific words in a huge block of text. An overall accuracy of 95% sounds great, doesn't it?
Yeah, sounds pretty good.
But if the system completely misses all the words it was supposed to find, meaning its recall is 0, it's useless for its intended purpose, despite the high overall accuracy. So the metrics chosen must be appropriate for what the AI is actually trying to do.
That makes sense. Context is everything. They also connect accuracy back to risk analysis and the need for continuous monitoring.
Yes, because performance can degrade over time, or new accuracy risks can emerge. So, question 4.2.1 asks how continuous accuracy will be measured and safeguarded once the system is live. 4.2.2 and 4.2.3 are about the process of setting and assessing those acceptance criteria and making sure the chosen measurement methods are actually appropriate.
4.2.4 and 4.2.5 cover the operational aspects, regularly checking the output, monitoring it for correctness, and having a process to analyze and correct any deviations in a timely manner.
And 4.2.6 interestingly loops back to the initial assessment phase in Part A by asking about the results of using alternative models. Did you test different technical approaches, and how did their accuracy compare? This reinforces the justification.
Section 4.3 is reliability. How's that different from accuracy?
Reliability is more about consistency. Does the system produce consistent results when given similar inputs or operating under similar conditions? A key part of this is reproducibility for individual outputs. If you run the system again with the identical model, identical input data, identical settings, and parameters, do you get the exact same result?
Okay. But also, does it reliably perform as expected in new, unseen situations?
Yes, that's the practical reliability aspect. Can you trust it? Question 4.3.1 is the straightforward check. Is the AI system reliable? 4.3.2 asks you to identify the most important factors that influence its performance. What makes it tick?
4.3.3 asks about testing reliability methods, specifically mentioning techniques like cross-validation.
Right, where you hold back some data purely for testing, data the model hasn't seen during training.
And 4.3.4 asks how the process of hyperparameter tuning was documented and assessed. Those are the technical settings of the model itself, right?
Exactly. How you arrive at those settings impacts reliability, so you need to document that process.
Okay. Section 4.4 is technical implementation. This covers how the AI system is actually built and integrated into the existing IT infrastructure.
Yeah, this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of IT operations, documenting things like hardware and software requirements, and clearly outlining the system architecture, how all the components fit together and interact, is absolutely crucial.
And good architecture helps mitigate risks, presumably.
Absolutely. A well-thought-out technical architecture reduces operational risks and helps ensure the system meets both technical and operational requirements. They suggest referring to existing documentation standards, like the INW Enterprise Architecture, if available. Makes sense to align.
The questions here cover the technical method of implementation, 4.4.1, how it fits into the existing infrastructure and the rollout plan, 4.4.2, describing the system architecture, 4.4.3.
Documenting specific hardware-software needs, 4.4.4, conditions if external hosting is used, 4.4.5, how access is configured, which is part of standard IT management, 4.4.6.
How it interacts with other hardware or software systems, 4.4.7, and how logging and monitoring are configured, 4.4.8. It's really about making sure the technical setup is sound and thoroughly documented.
Exactly. Moving on to section 4.5, reproducibility. This is closely linked to reliability and explainability, but distinct.
How is reproducibility defined in this context? It sounds similar to reliability.
It covers multiple aspects, reproducing the training, validation, and testing processes. It means registering the specific data used, documenting how the model was developed, tracking changes made over time,
Okay.
and ensuring that with the same inputs and conditions, you can get consistent output results. It also involves identifying any external situations or conditions that might affect the output and need to be recorded.
And it's related to traceability. That seems logical.
Yes, they go hand in hand. The document states reproducibility is closely related to traceability, where the main purpose is documenting data sets and processes. This involves version management for your data, the model itself, and the training pipeline. Good housekeeping, essentially.
So 4.5.1 asks if the system is reproducible and if you have a process in place to measure that.
4.5.2 asks if the system's output can be reconstructed both now and in the future, emphasizing the need for version management of models, data sets, and the conditions under which they were run.
4.5.3 asks if the model itself can be reconstructed from its parameters and a fixed seed. Can you explain what they mean by a seed here? That sounds specific.
Ah, yes, a seed. It's basically a starting value used in algorithms that incorporate randomness. Many machine learning processes, like training neural networks or certain types of sampling, involve elements of randomness. By setting a specific fixed seed value at the beginning of the process, you ensure that the sequence of random numbers generated is always the same every time you run it. This is absolutely essential if you need to be able to exactly reproduce the model's training process or its output results later on.
Got it. That's a key technical detail for debugging and auditing then.
It really is. 4.5.4 asks if the broad outlines of the system and its function can be reproduced based just on the documentation. And 4.5.5 asks how any changes made to the system over its operational lifetime will be documented to maintain that traceability and reproducibility. Version control again.
Okay. The last part of technical robustness is section 4.6, explainability.
Right. This section defines explainability from a technical perspective. It means not only understanding the technical processes happening inside the AI, but also the related human decisions that led to its design and implementation. It's about clarifying the rationale behind the choices made.
Why did we build it this way?
Exactly. And they note this is linked to the broader concept of accountability, which comes later in Section 7.
And explainability is needed for different groups, right? Not just the techies.
Yes. Question 4.6.1 asks if the system is sufficiently explainable and interpretable for the developers themselves. They need to understand why the model behaves the way it does for debugging, maintenance, and improvement.
Makes sense. Then 4.6.2 shifts the focus to the users. How is explainability for users considered during development? Users might not need to understand the complex math, but they need enough insight to correctly use the system and understand its limitations.
Right. And 4.6.3 asks what specific technologies or techniques were used to enhance explainability, things like S-shape values or LIME maybe, and why those particular methods were chosen, acknowledging that achieving transparency in complex models, the so-called black boxes, can be a real technical challenge.
Okay, that wraps up a very deep dive into technical robustness. Section 5 is data governance.
Data governance. This is all about the procedures and policies governing how data is managed throughout its life cycle. Who can access it, who owns it, its usability, integrity, security, and of course, data quality.
And privacy is a huge piece of this, I imagine.
It's central. Privacy is a fundamental human right that AI systems often impact. So, robust data governance is essential to comply with regulations like GDPR and the organization's own privacy policies. The document wisely points out that it is far easier and more effective to safeguard privacy from the very beginning up front, rather than trying to layer protections on top later.
Privacy by design. They also mentioned the mandatory DPIA pre-scan.
Yes. If the AI system involves processing personal data, a data protection impact assessment, DPIO pre-scan, is required under GDPR to determine if a full in-depth DPIA is necessary. That's a standard check.
And it's not just personal data. Confidential information, too, needs protection.
Correct. Any confidential information, like maybe classified data or trade secrets, must also be protected and secured. This links data governance directly to risk management. They also note that the AI Act supplements existing GDPR rules, adding specific data requirements for AI systems, particularly those deemed high risk.
Section 5.1 focuses specifically on data quality and integrity. This seems fundamental to reliable AI.
It truly is. They reiterate the garbage in, garbage out principle and acknowledge that real-world data often contains bias, inaccuracies, errors, missing values, you name it. Addressing these issues before the data is used to train or run the AI is absolutely critical.
They reference principles like fair and fact. What are those?
Yeah, the FAIR principles, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, and the closely related FACSI principles, fair, accurate, confidential, transparent, are mentioned as relevant guidelines for good data management, noting their connection to GDPR requirements as well.
And documenting data processes seems key here, too.
Absolutely. They stress that data sets and the procedures used to process them must be tested and thoroughly documented at every single stage: training, testing, deployment, and ongoing operation. This applies even if you purchased an off-the-shelf AI system. You still need to understand its data requirements and how data is handled. You can't just trust the vendor blindly.
For personal data, GDPR requires data to be correct and necessary for the specific purpose, right?
Yes. You need to document the defined purpose of the analysis and how you handle the data to ensure correctness and address errors. They also reference some guidelines from the Ministry of Justice and Security for algorithm use, which emphasize data quality at an operational level.
The questions in 5.1 seem to cover the entire data pipeline. 5.1.1 asks about the sources of the training data. Where did it come from?
5.1.2 is the general question on how data quality will be safeguarded. 5.1.3 asks about the necessity of the data being used. Do you really need all of it for this specific purpose? Minimization principle.
5.1.4 asks about preventing unintended data duplications. 5.1.5 is about the ability to update training or test data and how decisions are made about when to retrain the model, stop using the system, or require further development based on data changes. Lifecycle management again.
5.1.6 checks if the data actually meets the assumptions required by the chosen model. Different models expect data in different formats or distributions. 5.1.7 asks about the methods used to collect and collate the input data. 5.1.8 asks how data will be labeled, which is crucial for supervised learning tasks.
5.1.9 explores factors that could affect the quality of the input data, like collection methods or storage, and what mitigation measures are in place. And 5.1.10 asks if the input data is assessed for changes over time, data drift again, both during the initial training phases and during operational use. Patterns can shift.
Definitely. And there are also specific questions about the output data. 5.1.11 asks how the output data is stored and checked, especially if it's used as new input for the same or another system feeding back into the loop.
Right.
And 5.1.1 asks how the timely availability of the output data is ensured. Does it get where it needs to go when it needs to get there?
Okay. Section 5.2 is privacy and confidentiality. This reinforces the privacy considerations we touched on in Part A.
Exactly. It stresses the need to consider privacy legislation throughout the system's life cycle, again highlighting the benefit of addressing it up front during design.
Questions 5.2.1 to 5.2.6 cover handling personal data. The general approach, 5.2.1, confirming if GDPR applies, 5.2.2, verifying proportionality and subsidiarity of processing based on Part A, 5.2.3.
Assessing if the output could potentially trace back to individuals, 5.2.4. Ensuring involvement of relevant officials like the Chief Privacy Officer, CPO, Information Security Officer, ISO, or Chief Information Officer, CIO, 5.2.5. And asking how often the quality and necessity of processing personal data is evaluated, 5.2.6. Regular checks.
And for confidential data that isn't necessarily personal data.
Right. 5.2.7 asks if it will be used or stored, and 5.2.8 asks how its security will be ensured, protecting sensitive government or business information.
Makes sense. Okay, Section 6 is risk management.
This is about actively looking for and managing risks, particularly unforeseen ones that could lead to unreliable or damaging results. This ranges from simple, poor performance-causing issues to malicious attacks like hacking or data manipulation.
Section 6.1 is risk prevention.
While the AIIA process itself helps identify many potential dangers, unforeseen issues can still arise once the system is live. This section requires establishing mechanisms to manage and test for risks on an ongoing basis. They mention things like measures to prevent data poisoning, where someone maliciously manipulates the training data to sabotage the model, or ensuring robust storage security for the data and model.
And risks aren't static. They could appear after the system is deployed. You mentioned this earlier.
Precisely. The document notes that risks can emerge after the system is introduced, maybe due to changes in the environment or new attack methods. Your risk management measures need to be checked regularly. They suggest at least every 3 years or whenever significant changes are made to the system or its context.
And for high-risk systems, a formal risk management system is mandatory, right, with more detail in Appendix 1.
Yes, whereas for lower risk systems, a one-off analysis might suffice initially, although ongoing vigilance is still needed. Question 6.1.1 asks how the system was tested to ensure that the risk management measures put in place are actually appropriate and targeted.
Section 6.2 is alternative procedure. This sounds like having a plan B.
It is. And it's a crucial operational requirement. They strongly emphasize the importance of having a well-defined plan for dealing with system problems. What do you do when the AI fails, goes offline, or produces clearly problematic results?
What kind of fallback?
Could be anything appropriate, reverting to a simpler, maybe rule-based model, or even having a fully manual process that can take over if needed.
And they include that thought-provoking point about the risk of human skill deterioration, the calculator example.
Yes, it's a great point. Just like relying too much on a calculator can make you rusty at basic arithmetic, relying heavily on an AI system might lead to a decline in the human skills needed for the manual alternative. So, question 6.2.3 specifically asks if an equivalent effect to that calculator example is possible with this AI system, and if that potential skill deterioration is acceptable or desirable.
That's something to really consider. 6.2.1 asks for the detailed Plan B, and 6.2.2 asks you to assess the potential impact of system failure. What happens if it goes down?
Exactly. Section 6.3 is information security risks.
Security by design seems non-negotiable for government systems, surely.
It's fundamental. Security needs to be a consideration from the very start to manage risks like manipulation, unauthorized access, or cyber attacks. The document requires listing foreseeable risks using the organization's standard risk assessment process.
Looking at things like the CIA triad.
Yes, confidentiality, integrity, availability. Also classifying the information the system handles, implementing security measures based on guidelines like the Government Information Security Baseline, BIO in the Netherlands, performing security tests, and potentially doing additional analysis for AI-specific risks.
They list configured authorizations and a robust change process as essential elements too.
Yes, along with mechanisms for detecting errors and irregularities. They reference various guidance frameworks relevant to government security, including those from the Court of Audit, the Central Government Audit Service, ADR, the Intelligence Service, AFAD, and industry resources like OWASP, which now has specific guidance for AI systems too.
Okay, so the questions 6.3.1 to 6.3.6 cover how technical security risks are identified, reduced, and tested, 6.3.1, how to prevent unauthorized third parties from exploiting vulnerabilities, 6.3.2,
assessing the impact of unauthorized access to the source code, data, or results, 6.3.3, considering if someone could potentially take advantage of the AI's use as an alternative to a human decision process, 6.3.4.
having a system to log who uses the AI and for how long, audit trail 6.3.5, and noting any additional security measures taken beyond the standard organizational requirements, 6.3.6.
Right. The final section in Part B, Section 7, is accountability.
As a government document, this makes perfect sense. Accountability is absolutely core to public administration.
It is. The central government needs to be accountable internally, to Parliament, and ultimately to the public. Using AI, which can often be perceived as opaque or potentially unfair, raises significant accountability concerns. So, establishing clear processes for accountability is therefore essential.
Section 7.1 is transparency towards users.
This focuses specifically on the people who work with the AI system, the users or employees, distinguishing this from the deeper technical explainability needed by developers, which we covered in 4.6. These users need sufficient insight into how the system operates and its limitations so they can use it correctly and responsibly.
And the concept of humans in the loop is highlighted here again.
Crucially, the document stresses the need for users to have meaningful influence or control over decisions that are based on AI input. It shouldn't be fully automated decision-making without oversight in many cases. Question 7.1.2 asks what role people play in these decisions and how the system actually facilitates that human oversight.
Question 7.1.1 asks how that necessary insight into operation and limitations is provided to end users and, importantly, kept up to date. And 7.1.3 asks how the system is designed to be monitored and understood by everyone involved in its operation, ensuring that human oversight is practical.
Right. Then section 7.2 is communication to parties involved. This expands the communication requirement to a broader audience.
So this covers communication not just to internal users, but also to the end users, like citizens affected by decisions and any other parties involved.
Yeah.
A fundamental requirement seems to be awareness.
Yes. The document states explicitly that end users must be made aware that they are interacting with or being impacted by results generated by an AI system, rather than solely a human process. No hiding the AI.
Okay. They also touch on the right to know how the algorithm reached a particular outcome.
This requires communication that is clear, fair, and transparent. The purpose and limitations of the system need to be explained simply. The technical processes and any related human decisions must be understandable, and people should have the ability to retrieve information and potentially seek correction for outcomes.
They suggest appointing a contact person.
Yes, someone with real knowledge of the system to handle inquiries. And while fully tracing the operations of complex self-learning AI can be hard, they maintain that an appropriate explanation must always be possible for the end user. That's a key standard.
And citizens' rights under GDPR are relevant here too, like accessing data or disputing decisions.
Very much so. Citizens have rights to access their data, invoke other GDPR rights, and dispute decisions or results that are based on AI outputs. This necessitates proper data management and archiving, which links nicely to Section 7.4, the last one.
Got it. Questions 7.2.1 and 7.2.4 cover being transparent to different groups about the use of AI and specifically informing affected parties that results are AI generated and what that implies for them.
7.2.2 asks about mechanisms for end users to provide feedback or comment on the system, a feedback loop, and how that feedback is validated and followed up internally. 7.2.3 touches on the AI Act requirement for potentially including the system in an algorithm register or the EU database if it's high risk, public visibility.
Questions 7.2.5 and 7.2.6 are practical points about user support. Compiling a user manual and considering potential psychological side effects for users working closely with AI, like confusion or cognitive fatigue.
That's an interesting one. 7.2.7 is about providing different groups, citizens, colleagues, managers, with tailored insight into relevant aspects like data use, the model, or results. Different audiences need different info. 7.2.8 specifically asks about measures taken to ensure explainability specifically towards the end user.
7.2.9 asks if the system is transparent enough for the deployers, the organization using it, to correctly interpret and use the output. 7.2.11 asks if training is necessary for end users. Probably yes in many cases.
Likely. 7.2.11 asks how comments from all relevant parties are handled internally, and 7.2.12 is crucial for public systems. Is there clarity on the steps involved for lodging an objection, complaint, or appeal against a decision or outcome involving the AI system? People need recourse.
Absolutely. Section 7.3 is verifiability.
This is about how the data, the model, and the results can be evaluated, typically through internal or external audits. The document notes that stricter requirements for verifiability apply to riskier areas, which makes sense.
And transparency is key to this, being able to look under the hood.
Yes, insight into the source data, the system's workings, and the results it produces is deemed essential for verifiability, and providing this insight is the responsibility of the system's owner. Questions 7.3.1 to 7.3.3 cover how and by whom the system will be verified, how the organization provides accountability, often demonstrated through this verifiability, and who is responsible for providing independent audits and how those audits will be conducted.
Okay, finally, Section 7.4 is archiving, keeping records.
Exactly. Archiving means storing relevant information so it can be accessed and reused in the future. This is necessary for multiple reasons. Reconstructing the model or process, linking back to reproducibility, explaining the system to new staff, linking to explainability, providing documentation for accountability or audits, and complying with legal or regulatory retention periods.
They mention specific retention periods based on the AI Act and internal rules.
Yes, the AI Act requires minimum retention periods for logs and high-risk applications, and there are also standard retention periods based on internal INW selection lists for general records management.
The questions cover how input data is stored, 7.4.1, and its retention period, 7.4.2.
How the model itself is stored, 7.4.3, and how its versions are managed, 7.4.4. Version control is key here too, and the retention period for the output data, 7.4.5. This section ensures that the necessary information is preserved to enable future audits, accountability inquiries, and system understanding over time.
Wow. Okay. That's an incredibly comprehensive journey through the main parts of the document, the assessment of whether to use AI, and then all the detailed requirements for implementing and using it responsibly.
It truly covers the waterfront, doesn't it? From high-level ethical considerations down to the nitty-gritty practicalities of data management, security, and system archiving.
We also need to quickly cover the appendices, starting with the glossary. We've mentioned it, but it's there for reference.
Right. Although we've tried to explain terms as we went, the document includes a full glossary of terms. It defines key concepts used throughout, like AI system, bias, high-risk AI, user, provider, accountability, and many others. This is invaluable for ensuring a shared understanding, especially with those multidisciplinary teams involved.
Definitely helpful in a complex field with evolving language. Now, Appendix 1, Risk Level Assessment. This ties back to the AI Act.
Yes, this is a very practical appendix designed to help users correctly determine which AI Act risk level applies to their system. Unacceptable, high, or minimal low risk. And it's explicitly based on the area of application, which is key.
Why is that distinction important?
Because an AI system might have other significant risks, like maybe a high privacy impact assessed via a DPIA, but still be classified as low risk under the AI Act because of where and how it's used. The AI Act classification has specific legal consequences separate from other risk assessments. It's about the Act's definitions.
Okay, so the process walks you through the categories defined in the AI Act. First, Part A, Assessment of Unacceptable Risk. The banned stuff.
Exactly. This lists the types of AI systems that are outright prohibited under the AI Act. These include AI using subliminal or manipulative techniques to distort behavior, systems abusing vulnerabilities of specific groups, general social scoring systems as specifically defined by the Act, systems inferring emotions outside of medical or security contexts, and certain uses of real-time remote biometric identification in public spaces or biometric categorization based on sensitive personal data. If your system doesn't do any of these things, it's probably not an unacceptable risk.
Good to know. Then Part B, Assessment of High Risk.
This section is longer and more complex. It first defines high-risk AI generally as systems that profile individuals and are used in specific predefined fields or are safety components of certain regulated products listed across various EU directives like toys, medical devices, vehicles, etc.
Okay, profiling is a key element there.
It is. Then it lists the key areas of application that are considered high risk if they involve that profiling. Critical infrastructure management, like transport or utilities, education, vocational training, affecting access, employment worker management, access to self-employment, affecting hiring, promotion, task allocation.
A lot of sensitive areas.
Definitely. Access to and use of essential private and public services benefits, like credit scoring, dispatching emergency services, law enforcement, predicting crime, assessing evidence. Migration, asylum, border control, verifying documents, processing applications, and administration of justice democratic processes, influencing court decisions, voter behavior. It's a significant list.
And there's a note about certain products where the rules are still evolving.
Yes, a list specifically calling out safety components used in civil aviation, road vehicles, marine equipment, and railway systems, where future legislation might tighten things further. Basically, if, after going through this list, your system doesn't profile individuals and isn't in any of these specified high-risk areas or regulated products, it's probably classified as minimal or low risk under the AI Act.
Okay. Part C, assessment of transparency obligation is next.
This part checks if the system triggers specific transparency requirements under the AI Act, meaning users must be made aware they are interacting with AI. This applies if the system interacts directly with humans, like a chatbot,
Right.
generates or manipulates artificial content, like deepfakes or AI text generators,
Yeah.
recognizes emotion or categorizes based on biometric data, or uses deepfake technology. Answering yes to any of these means those transparency measures are needed. You have to tell people it's AI.
The appendix also lists some exceptions where the AI Act's stricter requirements might not apply.
Yes. Areas like military purposes, AI used solely for certain law enforcement justice purposes, though these are complex and often still subject to other rules. AI research and development, open source development phases before market placement, activities not involving professional use, and systems that do not fundamentally influence the outcome of a decision-making process.
But there's a really important condition for those exceptions, isn't there?
Absolutely vital. They only apply if the AI system does not perform profiling of individuals. If an AI system performs profiling, it is automatically considered a high-risk application according to the AI Act, regardless of these potential exceptions. Profiling is the trigger.
And they acknowledge that determining these risk levels can sometimes be complex, especially with evolving definitions and interpretations.
Yes, they mention that definitions are still developing and uncertainty exists. They point to resources like the Dutch central government's regulatory AI sandbox as a place for organizations to get help and guidance on these classifications, which seems sensible.
Okay. Appendix 2 provides additional questions specifically for high-risk systems.
Right. So if Appendix 1 determined your system is high risk, you must complete this appendix as well. It essentially translates the specific obligations from the AI Act into concrete questions to ensure you're implementing the necessary safeguards.
And it differentiates between roles.
Yes, between questions for the user, that's the organization deploying or using the system, sometimes called the deployer, and the developer, the organization building or providing the system, often called the provider. The provider is defined as someone who develops, provides, or makes substantial changes to a system under their own name.
Let's quickly cover the types of questions for the users or deployers. What do they need to ensure?
For users, they cover things like assessing if the system poses a significant risk to health, safety, or fundamental rights, and requiring documented reasons if it does. They need to ensure robust monitoring and operation, retain those system logs for at least 6 months, and implement effective human oversight measures, ensuring the people involved are competent, trained, and have the authority to intervene or override the system.
Technical robustness for users involves checking that the data used is relevant and representative for their specific context, that the provider has supplied necessary technical documentation, and crucially, that the system allows for effective human oversight, meaning the ability to verify, interpret, and potentially disregard the AI's output.
Right. Reliability questions for users focus on ensuring performance metrics, like accuracy levels, are clearly stated in user instructions provided by the developer. For data governance, users must ensure the training data used by the developer met detailed quality requirements specified in the Act, covering things like design choices, origin transparency, processing steps, assumptions made, assessing data suitability, assessing bias, taking measures against bias, and identifying data shortcomings. The user has a responsibility to check this.
Risk management for users includes verifying the system was tested appropriately before use, documenting a formal risk management system, including risk analysis, assessment, evaluation of new risks via post-market monitoring, and defining mitigation measures, safeguarding collaboration with authorities, like having contact persons, and specifically considering vulnerable groups who might be affected by the system.
They also mentioned that the European AI Office is developing templates to help users meet these complex obligations, which will be helpful. For communication, users must notify relevant authorities when putting a high-risk system into service, register it in the EU database, and compile detailed user instructions covering identity, characteristics, limitations, purpose, future changes, human oversight needs, resources needed, maintenance, description of mechanisms, and performance metrics. Quite a list.
And for high-risk generative AI specifically, any extra checks for users.
Yes. Users of high-risk generative AI must ensure documentation on possibilities limitations is provided, there's a clear policy on safeguarding copyrights in the output, and a detailed summary of the training content used for the model is available. Transparency about the training data. There's also a separate point requiring prior judicial permission for the use of real-time remote biometric identification systems by law enforcement.
Okay, what about the questions for developers or providers of these high-risk systems? They seem to have a lot of obligations.
They certainly do. Developers have a significant burden under the AI Act. They must document their compliance with all requirements, referencing Annex 4 of the Act, ensure detailed technical documentation is accessible to users, explicitly indicate if their system is high risk, and set up and document a comprehensive quality management system, QMS.
What does that QMS need to cover?
Pretty much everything. Design strategy, risk management procedures, testing, data management, post-market monitoring, incident reporting, communication strategy, documentation registration, resource management, and an accountability framework within their organization. Wow.
They also need to store AI system logs automatically, establish a conformity assessment procedure to demonstrate compliance, issue an EU declaration of conformity and retain it for 10 years, and in specific cases for certain high-risk products, have that declaration approved by a designated supervisory authority, a notified body.
And they need to put the CE mark on it.
Yes, developers must provide the CE marking on the system if it complies, signifying it meets EU standards. They also need procedures for taking corrective measures if the system becomes non-compliant after release, like removing it from market, deactivating or recalling it, and informing users and authorities.
Yeah.
And finally, ensure the system complies with relevant European accessibility requirements. It's a comprehensive set of obligations for providers to ensure their high-risk systems meet the standard before and after they hit the market.
Okay, that's a lot for high-risk systems. Finally, Appendix 3. Points to consider regarding generative AI. This feels very timely. Extremely timely. This appendix provides tailored guidance for completing the main AIIA specifically for generative AI models like large language models, LLMs, acknowledging they have unique characteristics. It starts by defining generative AI, algorithms that generate new content, and reiterating the Dutch cabinet's position that it should serve human well-being and be used responsibly.
And it immediately gets into the nature of this technology, the under-the-bonnet aspects.
Yes, describing what's typically going on. Massive neural networks producing statistical outputs, often without true underlying logic or understanding of reality. The output can be variable, difficult to reproduce exactly, hard to explain the reasoning behind, and sometimes difficult to verify for correctness, the hallucination problem.
Which leads to a crucial point.
A very crucial point. You should only use generative AI if an outcome that is unexplainable or unverifiable is acceptable for the intended purpose. If you need guaranteed accuracy or full explainability, current Gen AI might not be the right tool.
That's a very strong and practical caution for users.
It is, and it's reinforced by the provisional position mentioned from the Dutch central government. Non-contracted applications, like using public versions of ChatGPT, etc., are in principle not permitted for government use if there's any risk of breaking the law, like privacy or copyright, unless both the provider and the user can demonstrate full compliance. This signals real caution before using public models for sensitive government work.
The appendix then goes through how this impacts different sections of the main AIIA. For purpose and necessity, it notes generative AI can challenge public values like transparency and explainability.
Exactly. For fundamental rights, it raises important questions about the ethics of the training data, was it sourced responsibly, and the working conditions of the human data labelers, click workers, often involved in refining these models.
Sustainability is a major point too, right?
Huge point. Training and running massive generative models uses enormous amounts of energy. So the document advises considering if a less complex system could achieve the same goal and exploring energy-saving technologies. And, of course, it tells you to explicitly consider that provisional government decision about non-contracted models when assessing necessity.
For technical robustness, bias is a significant concern with generative AI, given the internet-scale training data.
Yes. You must constantly check the output for bias, as the training data is often biased, and the model structure itself can sometimes exacerbate this. While techniques like human feedback and guardrails help mitigate bias, they don't eliminate it, and other detection reduction methods are needed. Vigilance is key.
Accuracy, reliability, and reproducibility are also challenging for Gen AI.
Very much so. The appendix states quite clearly you should only use generative AI for purposes that don't demand high levels of accuracy, reliability, or reproducibility. You must take measures against hallucinations, those convincing but incorrect outputs, and carefully assess the risks associated with potentially unreliable outcomes. Quantifying the quality of Gen AI output is inherently difficult compared to traditional models.
Technical implementation considerations for generative AI often involve external hosting, using vendor platforms.
Right. If you use externally hosted models, you need crystal clear contractual agreements with the supplier about how your data is used. Example, can they use it for retraining the model? And assess the risk of unauthorized access or viewing of your data by the provider or others. The Cabinet's position also expresses a preference for using open source generative AI models where possible, presumably for greater control and transparency.
And explainability for generative AI circles back to that black box issue, doesn't it?
It reinforces the earlier point. Only use Gen AI if explainability is not a hard requirement for the specific use case. Assess the risks this lack of explainability poses and clearly communicate the limitations to the staff using it. While it's often a black box, the appendix does mention ongoing initiatives aimed at improving the transparency of these models, so it's an evolving space.
For data governance, the training data poses unique challenges for generative AI.
Yes. Training data for large models is almost certain to contain vast amounts of personal data and copyrighted material, often scraped from the web. For most proprietary models, the exact quality and content of the training data are unknown to the user, although the AI Act is starting to require more transparency from providers here. There are significant GDPR compliance issues when processing personal data within this context that need careful navigation.
So privacy requires specific agreements with the supplier if you use their model.
Crucially, you need agreements defining responsibilities for processing data, controller-processor roles, clarifying whether your input data can be used to train the supplier's model, and establishing a proper processing agreement to reduce the likelihood of data breaches related to the AI service. Information security risks specific to LLMs are also mentioned, referencing resources like the OWASP Top 10 LLM Risks, which is a good practical pointer.
And accountability, particularly verifiability, ties back directly to the explainability challenge.
Precisely. If the core model is inherently difficult to explain or understand, a black box, then verifying its internal process for accountability or auditing purposes becomes inherently challenging, if not impossible in some cases. The appendix highlights this direct link.
This document, the AIIA, truly provides a detailed, structured approach for organizations within the Dutch Ministry of INW and potentially other government bodies or even private organizations looking for a framework to systematically think through the complex process of deploying AI responsibly.
It really does. It covers that crucial assessment phase to decide if AI is the right fit and proportionate, and then provides a really deep dive into the technical, data, risk, and accountability considerations needed to implement and use it correctly, all while linking back to major regulatory frameworks like the EU AI Act.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener, grappling with AI in your own context?
Mm.
Considering the level of detail and the multidisciplinary effort frameworks like this AIA require for responsible AI, does it suggest that perhaps the biggest challenge for organizations isn't just building the AI technology itself, but doing all the surrounding work, the assessment, the data governance, the risk management, the documentation, the ongoing monitoring needed to make it safe, fair, and accountable?
It certainly highlights that the promise of AI technology is only one part of the equation. The heavy lifting, the really hard work, seems to lie in the rigorous assessment, careful implementation, and the ongoing vigilance required to prevent harm and ensure public trust. The question is, are organizations truly prepared for that scale of work, or is the focus still too much on just the tech itself?
That's definitely some food for thought as we all continue navigating the age of AI. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.